Hello, this is David Burton with University of Missouri Extension and teaching our final session here today in this series, really focused on developing relationships, dealing with fear about neighbors, the art of receiving, and really taking a look at what some of the research says that people expect from their neighbors. When it comes to neighboring, we really live in an unprecedented time. We have access to 24-hour news channels, and a lot of that news is about evil things that happen around us, really all over the world. So there are entire shows that are made just to mine these evil stories. And when we see these over and over again, it begins to create a low grade fear that we carry around with us all of the time. It begins to impact how we think about others and the things that we assume that we know about the unknown. This type of thinking, this type of fear is really toxic, especially when it comes to developing neighborhood relationships. Uh, I, I remember a neighbor in a neighborhood that we lived in when we were early married, and he was a single man, older, shy, lived down the street, didn't see him out too often. And because of just kind of the nature of the home and not seeing him out much, there were different narratives that bounced around in my mind, different stories that started to play around in my imagination about what type of person this was or maybe what he was doing. Maybe you've had those same types of experiences. Um, a lot of what was feeding my imagination was things that I had been seeing on the news about individuals. So then one day I was out walking and he was out mowing his yard. I said hello, and we stopped and had one of those kind of awkward corner of the lawn conversations. Uh, and we talked a little bit uh, further. And because I had that connection with him, I came to find out that I came to understand that he was a widower. He didn't have any family that lived in the state. He was just really lonely and shy. He was really dying for something of depth, for real relationships. And all these assumptions that I had about him, based on what I'd seen in the news and where my imagination went, had prevented me from having a relationship with him sooner. Those things stood in the way of really getting to know the person. And I think that can be true for a lot of us when we make assumptions about our neighbors and maybe some of the things that we think are going on at the house, or maybe even have gone on in the house in the past. And those things stand in the way of making acquaintances and developing relationships with our neighbors. Uh, we look at we look around at these people, different people, and we begin to build roadblocks that prevent us from getting to know them as individuals, taking that next step to know them as a person. So let's be honest. There are evil people in our world, and there is a chance that one of them lives on your block. But I think we all agree with this that there are fewer evil, sick people out there than maybe we think there are. I, I want to encourage you to begin to question some of the assumptions that you have, some of those assumptions you have made about people living around you or near you. Spend time with people who you might not normally get close to. Spend some time with them, get to know their story. This is the first step toward having a relationship. Uh, so I want to encourage you to do that. Fear is about perception, and if it's left unattended, then it kind of grows even to a point of paralyzing us. Fear is toxic to our relationships, it's toxic to us, um, partly because it leads to isolation. And then isolation, a lack of social contact, um, that's the opposite of what we were created for. And so it just becomes this, it can become a cycle, almost a self-fulfilling prophecy too, as our fear drives us into being more isolated. The isolation then adds to loneliness. Loneliness can lead to paranoia and leading assumptions about people. So you can see it's a dangerous cycle to put yourself into. Uh, the genius of this principle of um, getting to know people, of overcoming assumptions, um, the genius of getting to know this principle and of getting to know your neighbors is that it brings people closer together. And that builds trust and builds opportunities to work together for the improvement of your neighborhood and your community. So let's talk a little more about these neighborhood fears or fears of neighbors. Um, if we were meeting one-on-one and having a discussion, there's some questions that I would probably pose to the group. And one of those would be, are you comfortable or are you uncomfortable about spending time with anyone on your block? Anyone you would feel strange being seen with? We'd kind of talk through that a little bit. Um, we all battle hidden judgments and fears. Sometimes we're aware of the way that we're seeing others. Sometimes we're really just afraid of others that they will see us. Uh, and we are often tempted to judge people. None of this is good. Uh, my wife and I had to look at this. We finally decided that even though we're cautious with our kids, we didn't want to leave them a legacy of fear, of being fearful about everyone around us. Not until you had a reason to, not until maybe you knew more. So I think that's a healthy approach to this issue. Uh, Here's another question. What's the worst case scenario if you are engaged, if you engaged your neighbors? What's the worst case scenario if you engaged your neighbors? Does knowing them increase the likelihood of your worst case scenario happening? I think I get that idea kind of from the book The Worry Cure and how to overcome some of our worries, thinking through worst case scenarios, which rarely ever come true. I mean, we're all afraid that horrible stuff that we see on the news could happen in our household and to those around us. And sometimes it's just easier to hide and hope that it all goes away. But the irony is, this isolation ends up making us more suspicious and more fearful of people. If these kinds of people are living around us, it would be way better to know that. And usually we realize that they aren't who we are afraid they might have been. We won't know that if we don't begin to learn their names and begin to develop relationships. Who do you think is scared of you? Chances are, if you're suspicious of someone else and scared of them, someone may feel the same way about you in your neighborhood. Most of us don't realize this. Our fears make people afraid of us as well. And we can kind of perpetuate that cycle. If we're also living in fear and then isolation, we perpetuate the cycle of other people being fearful of us or having suspicions because we withdraw, and that ends up making people then afraid of us. So while we're busy guessing who they are and believing the worst, they're often doing the same thing about us. And someone has to break that cycle. What do you think are the main reasons people are often afraid of neighbors? I think people see stories about sex offenders and violent neighbors, drug addicts, and they assume those types of things. Um, that seems to be what I hear the most often. And people then use that as an excuse to not have contact with any of their neighbors. Or do I have a sex offender on my block? I'm not going to take time to get to know them or anyone else. So how would it be different if you knew your neighbor's story? We have mercy for others when we understand their story. And we certainly always want mercy for ourselves. But maybe by knowing the individual's story, you're able to have mercy for them. It's just a fact that the unknown causes lots of assumptions. So it's better to work on getting to know people and overcoming those assumptions. Now, another thing that can be a hindrance to neighboring that I have seen and that I've heard in a lot of different conversations, and that is the ability to receive. So oftentimes, if we've not been neighboring, we don't have those relationships, we've not had to do that, and it's easy to get out of the practice of receiving, and it's easy to forget how important that is to let people engage with you in your life and to help you. So here's some of the questions we would ask if we were meeting in person. What are your neighbors knowledgeable or passionate about, and how could you enter into their world and allow them to serve you? Your neighbors probably have hobbies or skills. They have a lot to offer, and often they're willing to offer those skills and abilities if we just humble ourselves and ask. Maybe you have a neighbor who's great at woodworking, or a neighbor who is great at painting, or maybe there's other skills they have that they can help you. Maybe they're keep a great lawn and they can give you great advice on how to keep your lawn. We want to learn how to watch for ways that other people can help us, and then humble ourselves enough to accept that, to receive it, and to give them joy in serving us. Are you good at allowing other people to care for you? You know, many Americans in general have a tendency toward paternalism. That means we think we have something to offer, but we can't imagine that they have anything to offer. And so paternalism puts one party in a position of power over the other, and makes for an unequal relationship. Real relationship requires give and take. Nobody has all the power, and nobody has all the needs. And so it steals a person's dignity to force them always to be in a position of need and never receiving help from them when they want to be of help. We should try to maintain a balance in this area as much as possible. If you're always the one in power, then we should probably ask for help. And if we're always one in need, we should realize that we have a lot to give to others. This art of receiving is extremely important. It's not complicated. It really just comes down to being aware of your needs and kind of opening your eyes, then being vulnerable enough to ask and to receive at times. Maybe it's just asking for help raking your leaves or doing something in the garage. But practicing the art of receiving can be very important to developing relationships. Now, in this module, you're going to find some of the data and the executive summary and graphics from the State Farm Good Neighbor Study. They did one in 2011, and they did a follow-up study in 2015. And it's really kind of a landmark study on this topic of neighboring. It's a wealth of information. And I'll share a couple of highlights from that study, but I would encourage you to read through it, and especially the graphic and the executive summary. But in that study, we discovered that millennials, they are not connecting with neighbors, but they want to. About 40% of millennials wish they were more connected with their neighbors. And but they are the ones that are least likely to have that face-to-face interaction. older generation has a much higher percentage of face-to-face interaction. Now, the neighborhood dead organization or the neighborhood gathering, when those occur, those seem to be organized by a dedicated few. In the State Farm survey, this most recent one, 2015, 58% of neighbors say that it's important for neighbors to socialize, but only 16% of men and 11% of women have ever helped organize a social event. So people like the idea of it. They think it is important. They just don't take the initiative to plan them. And of course, I think when you get around to that point, it's important to work with somebody as a pair in planning community events, at least a pair, maybe more than that, to help prevent burnout. And so someone's able to plan the next one. Welcoming to a neighborhood is very important. We see that in this study. The vast majority, 75% of neighbors say it is important to welcome new neighbors. But ironically, only 41% say they were welcomed when they moved in, and only 46% have actually welcomed someone to the neighborhood. So, this is a basic entry point when someone's moving in, to do something to show them that they are welcome and make them feel welcome. That's a basic entry-level move into the area of neighboring. But if you're like me, maybe you live in a neighborhood where there's not a lot of homes for sale, and that doesn't happen very often. Then everyday helpfulness might be your ticket. Everyday helpfulness is indicated as a good neighbor trait, but only 37% of respondents said they were likely to ask a neighbor for help with a small project. And which is ironic because 51% of those felt like helping a neighbor was something that an example they use to define what a good neighbor is. So people just don't always participate and do what they perceive as having high value. That comes into having to explain to them what's in it for them, why it is important to be a good neighbor, and the benefits they can get from that. In his book, The Vanishing Neighbor, Mark Dunkelman talks about friendships being like Saturn and its rings. We're Saturn, and the first set of rings are our family and our very closest friends, people that we now stay connected to through technology. The middle ring is our neighbors. And in our not too distant past, in our history, that second ring of neighbors were extremely important because of proximity. We saw them, so we had interaction with them. Maybe we participated in civic life with them. We helped them. This is an important ring. But now, over the last 20 years, maybe more, we've seen people, Americans, focus more on this third ring that Dunkelman talks about, which is people that you're acquainted with through hobbies and associations and maybe your kid's sporting team. It's a much looser association usually, and it does not have the depth of friendship. It may not even have the proximity in that you may just be seeing each other for 8 or 10 games a year if it's a baseball team, for example. But Americans they've stayed focused on their inner circle through technology and staying connected. They have basically leapfrogged over neighbors and now spend a lot of their time focused on these associations, friendships that are made through hobbies. And honestly, that is a harder group to maintain connectiveness with over time. It's a less meaningful, less powerful relationship. The power is still here in this middle ring. When we really focus on our neighbors. And we see some of that in this State Farm survey. So how do we win over friends? How do we develop friendships with our neighbors? There's lots of advice on that, on how to be kind to others. Dale Carnegie's friend, book on how to how to win friends and influence others, uh, pride, provides a wealth of information and lots of examples. And so, kind of summarizing some of that, but putting it here in this neighborhood area, uh, you, if you're really serious about developing these relationships, you need to begin by saying hello. Um, all of us, from millennials to seniors, we want to connect with neighbors. And even though we don't always act on those instincts, but trust your gut and say hello to a neighbor. Wave them down at the fence line, say hi, initiate, get those conversations started. That's an important way to be kind to your neighbor and to develop those relationships. The other one I call tweet me, text me. In this electronic era, the text has really become the new doorbell. We text to find out if someone can have company or if we can come over. Um, and so, as you're trying to get to know neighbors, this is the perfect time to tweet or text them or somehow engage them in social media uh, to get them to know you better. And then a third one is kind of the can you spare a cup of sugar category. Uh, Certainly goes back to receiving, but it also involves just the act of asking for some help. Um, you're often not going to be able to call on friends and family. You're going to need to rely on someone who has some proximity if you're needing a cup of sugar or something. That's important to have it right then so you can do your cooking. Um, Literally, most neighbors say they welcome the opportunity to support the neighbor next door. And we see that in the State Farm survey. Um, One of the other techniques for being kind in your neighborhood, we've titled Party On. Um, Socializing with neighbors is a high priority for many of us, including millennials, who 71% of them say socializing with their neighbors was a priority. Um, there's some variance among cultures, um, but at the very least, the category with that saw this as the very least important, Hispanics, still 62% of them saw this as important. But but nobody's putting these events together. So you have to be the spark plug. You have to initiate, get up off the couch, call someone you know in the neighborhood, maybe two somebodies that you know, and take a look at our block party kit and just go through the ideas of what you need to do to put together an event and then to communicate it out. Extremely important. Um, Trust your instincts and say hello. No one's going to fault you for being friendly. No one is going to fault you for going out of your way to say hi. Um, I realize that privacy is a high priority for most people in today's busy society, but resist the urge to um, do that. Resist the urge to just hide from people. Instead, trust your instincts and go with hello. Uh, Lots of available research showing uh, that you just go on and you do it as far as knocking on a door and getting acquainted with neighbors. Most neighbors actually do want to connect with someone in some way. So trust your instincts. I think I mentioned that texting is the new knocking. It's okay to, uh, if you have their contact information, texting to see if they're home or that they're available before you come over and ring the doorbell and visit. And this gives neighbors, lets neighbors know um, the best way to get a hold of you and what works best for your schedule. I don't see anything wrong with the texting. And of course, if you don't know them at all, it's going to take a little bit of work to get their number and maybe start having some good dialogue by text, at least, to open some of those doors. And then finally, be the first to welcome newcomers. When someone moves in, you be there first with materials about the neighborhood, information about how to sign up for water, maybe, and trash, and help move a few boxes. Being Sometimes we've taken boxes of donuts before to new neighbors. They'll remember the kindness, and it's good that you take that first initial step to make that happen. Uh, if you move in next to me, it's even okay if you're the person moving in to bring me a good pie. I'm just saying. Uh, Usually it's reciprocated the other way. And that State Farm research, we see that all the age groups say that that's important. But someone has to be the spark plug and get up and do it. Well, that kind of quickly covers these topics of the art of receiving and then the concern about fear of neighbors. I hear that probably more than anything is that someone saying, well, we have a sex offender in our neighborhood, or I don't trust the guy living next door to me. And there may be really valid reasons for that. Maybe you see his name in the police blotter every week. But I would venture to say more times than not, our assumptions prove wrong. And it is possible that we may be using our assumptions just to keep from getting to know our neighbors. And that's not the right thing either. Thanks for being with us on this journey. And thanks for taking those steps. Stay connected. Keep taking those steps to learn your neighbors' names and to get their basic contact information. So vital, so important. All right. Well, thank you for joining us for this class, and thank you for joining me this evening for this short teaching. Take care.